Ladies and gentlemen, my name is TotalBiscuit, and this is why we can't have nice things. I haven't done a video like this in a little while. The last one was, of course, for Dungeon Keeper, but for the next 6 months, we're going to be doing one every month. We're going to be doing it regular, and that's as a direct result of our partnership with GOG.com, the guys over at Good Old Games. And I've been meaning to do this one for a very long time. This was on the short list for potential titles to go up when I was thinking of making this a full series back over on the Game Station many years ago. And it's been on my list of absolute classics for a very long time. And that's, of course, Giant Citizen Kabuto, which was developed by Planet Moon Studios and published by Interplay back in December of the year 2000. It's almost 14 years old at the time of recording. It was received, of course, very well by the critics, as pretty much every game in this series was, one way or the other. It was Planet Moon's first game, a company founded by the ex-Shiny Entertainment developers Bob Stevenson, the CEO, and Nick Brunty, the president. The history of titles was unfortunately fairly short-lived. The company closed its doors in 2011, having had its staff acquired by Big Point Games, but not the company or indeed its intellectual property and game assets themselves. They developed numerous titles, such as the spiritual successor to Giant Citizen Kabuto, Armed and Dangerous, alongside LucasArts. They then developed a couple of games for the PlayStation Portable, including Infected and Afterburner Black Falcon, and followed that one up with a couple of Wii releases, Smarty Pants and Battle of the Bands. Unfortunately, neither of these titles were particularly well received. After developing an iPhone game, as well as a couple of titles named Brain Quest for the DS, they were tasked with creating a version of Fifth Cell's Drawn to Life for the Wii, and their final title, as unfortunately is so often the case with these companies, was a licensed game for Disney's Tangled movie, released in 2010 on the Nintendo Wii and Nintendo DS. It is unfortunately a very common theme amongst the games which are featured in this particular series that the developer starts off with great ideas and critically acclaimed titles but doesn't have the sales figures to back them up, and Giants is no exception. While for some reason the Mac OS version of the title actually sold out of physical copies within months of its release, it was reported that the Windows version sold poorly, and the PlayStation 2 version even more so, with only 11,000 copies sold in the US in the first 6 months. Unsurprisingly, as with many of these kind of titles, it's a little difficult to figure out exactly why it was that Giant Citizen Kabuto didn't sell particularly well, although some of it can be attributed to the fact that the game had very high system requirements and didn't run particularly well on the recommended system specs given with the boxed copy. This may have had something to do with the fact that the game ran on an engine created by Planet Moon themselves by the name of Amityville. Tim Williams, the creative director of Planet Moon, claimed that there were many good engines out there, but most of them were, quote, very good at keeping you indoors and setting up strict boundaries for the design. Basically, this would have been too limiting for the art and gameplay direction we were heading for with this game, and that is of course why they went with an in-house engine. The team had had previous experience developing engines with the title MDK, which they worked on during their time at Shiny Entertainment. The decision to go with an in-house engine did result in some extremely large and impressive levels. The game made use of advanced effects and even supports modern 16:9 resolutions in a game that was developed 14 years ago. Planet Moon's aesthetic design also mirrors that of its previous work in Shiny Entertainment, where many of its titles held something of a timeless quality, which is something that many of the ambitious early 3D games were unable to attain. As a direct result, playing Giant Citizen Kabuto today is certainly not an unpleasant experience on the eye. Unfortunately, as you might imagine, with the development of an in-house engine comes many problems. The game was criticized upon its release for being buggy, as well as poor performance on several systems, and also lacking key features such as the ability to save in-game. That said, due to the fact that the game found a new home on GOG.com and had developed a cult following, patching and work to fix the game continued, with with the last major patch being released in 2009, a full 9 years after the release of the original game, featuring major improvements to the multiplayer system, as well as several graphical upgrades, including support for a DirectX 8 renderer. This did a fantastic job of enhancing an already fairly impressive engine that has significant advantages such as very large outdoor levels and massive draw distance. Perhaps more importantly, the unofficial patch added a server browser, allowing users to join games without needing the IP address of the host itself. Unfortunately, the community for the game's multiplayer is very small. However, the site Giants World Domination, that being giantswd.org, continues to host servers and organize events to this day. The development history of Giant Citizen Kabuto is certainly rather interesting. The game itself was developed with a team of only 9 people. What was worse is that Andy Astor, the CFO and vice president of the company, was diagnosed with stage 4 mantle cell cancer in the middle of development. Due to the small size of the team, this resulted in delays to the development, which was supposedly used to enhance the multiplayer component of the game, and after over 3 years, the game was eventually released. Sadly, Andy lost his battle with cancer, making the release of the game certainly a very bittersweet experience for the team. According to the VP Bob Stevenson, much of the delay was used to create the now signature multiplayer of the title, which is a extremely unique experience involving 3 very different asymmetrical factions all battling for supremacy over a large map. It incorporated elements of third-person action games, brawlers, and real-time strategy. It also showcased a real asymmetry, something that is very rare and is perhaps only now coming back into video games with the forthcoming 2014 release Evolve, which pits 4 hunters against one ever-evolving monster. Back in the year 2000, Giant Citizen Kabuto went one better, taking 5 jetpack-equipped, heavily armed but tiny mechs and putting them against 3 of the magical Sea Reapers and 1 constantly evolving and growing giant monster known as the Kabuto itself in a large battle for resources on mysterious alien tropical islands. It could be argued that the entire single-player experience, while lengthy, was simply leading up to the multiplayer, with separate stories for all 3 of the factions within the game, and detailed explanations as to the various gameplay systems up to and including the base building aspect. However, while the single player did a fantastic job of demonstrating the mechanics of Giant Citizen Kabuto, where it really shone was its sense of humor, laden with exceptional cutscenes and really good voice acting. The game featured a British bawdy style of humor, which is a little unusual considering Planet Moon Studios was in fact based in San Francisco.
Reggie, I hear you're quite the man about toon.
Oh, you know, trying to give myself a little taste now and then.
That was me, you dirty wee bastard! If it weren't for you, Timmy would be fine now. So you better damn well get him back.
The sense of humor continued onto its spiritual successor, but unfortunately slightly less complex, Armed and Dangerous, which was, at least in terms of its mechanics, more of a straight-up third-person shooter. Contrasting the somewhat ridiculous sense of humor was a sweeping soundtrack by composer Mark Morgan, who you may know from games such as Fallout, Fallout 2, and Planescape Torment. Indeed, you can find his work to this very day in the MMO Allods Online, and he is currently creating music for Wasteland 2 as well as Torment, Tides of Numenera, which of course is very appropriate considering his involvement in those previous classics of yesteryear. Mark Morgan, however, was not the only composer involved. The legendary Jeremy Soule himself, composer of innumerable excellent video game soundtracks, including, of course, the extremely well-known soundtracks for the Elder Scrolls games, took over work on the soundtrack after Mark Morgan had to step back for personal reasons. The game is credited with both Mark Morgan and Jeremy Soule's work. However, it was initially reported that the composer Mark Snow, best known perhaps for his work on the X-Files, had been hired for initial work on the score, although he is not credited in the final game. The gorgeous graphics, the sense of humor, the interesting and innovative mechanics, as well as a multiplayer mode that hasn't been matched to this day, all combined to create a cult classic in the form of Giant's Citizen Kabuto. So let's dive into the game and show you some of the single player, which thankfully does show you elements of the multiplayer mechanics as well. Unfortunately, it is very difficult these days to get a multiplayer game together, but we will show you plenty of the single player, and I'll point out exactly what makes this game truly interesting. The single-player campaign of Giant Citizen Kabuto consisted of 3 main factions: the Mechs, the Reapers, and the Kabuto itself. The antagonists of the game are also, strangely enough, the Reapers. I don't wish to spoil the story, but the majority of enemies that you will be fighting in the game are Reapers themselves. The Reaper character that you play is someone else entirely, and it's all explained throughout the story. We're going to start by looking at the way that the mech levels work, and this is actually the final mech level here, which allows you to access all of the technology and weapons as long as you're able to construct a base. This is also a really good demonstration of how the multiplayer works, since the signature multiplayer mode in Giant Citizen Kabuto involves 3 factions, 2 of which construct bases by capturing resources on the map, including the so-called Smarties, these rather irritating little alien fellows that we're carrying back to our base. They could be set to work and construct elements of the base as long as they were fed with Vimp meat, which could be collected by slaughtering herds of docile creatures called Vimps, which you could find around the map. These Smarties will refuse to work if they do not have enough food. Outside of that, they will construct various buildings, starting off with the pub, which you can see being constructed right there, and leading on to a workshop, command center, a gift shop, which allows you to acquire various weapons and items, as well as recharge your health. And eventually, after level 2 walls and gates have been constructed in preset positions around the base spawn area, you can build the final building, which is the party house, also known as a pub, a bigger pub. Not only do the Smarties no longer require food once you've built this, but it unlocks a large selection of powerful deployables, which can be put pretty much anywhere on the map, including floating guard towers, anti-air turrets, tunnels, which can be used for teleportation, as well as the pop-up bomb, a giant super weapon, which, if transported into the middle of an enemy base, is going to deal massive damage. The Reapers also have a similar base building system. I'll show you a little bit of that later, but it's the Kabuto that is truly interesting because he is a mobile base in and of himself. While the Mechs and the Reapers are competing for the Smarties in order to have them build various buildings in their base, the Kabuto is attempting to eat the Smarties, and he will be able to evolve and grow, gaining new abilities and, of course, size in the process. This 3-way asymmetrical battle for resources is what made the multiplayer mode truly special, and why it's of course very disappointing that currently the community for the multiplayer is almost non-existent. It's really something that we don't actually see all that much. We do have a certain degree of asymmetry in titles like, say, Natural Selection, but 3-way play with characters who clearly have power differences, well, that's very rare. And it's not really all that surprising. Let's be frank, most players want to be on a similar power level to other players within the game, and in Giants that is clearly not the case. While you can be a very skilled mech player, especially with guns like the sniper rifle, and that will allow you to one-on-one versus a Reaper is most likely otherwise going to beat you in a straight-up duel. They are simply more powerful characters, and of course the Kabuto is massive, and often at the higher levels takes an entire enemy team to bring them down. But it's the asymmetry that made the mode truly interesting. Each experience was very different, and it involved different strategies and learning different skills in order to truly master the game, and it's not something that has really been repeated all that much in PC gaming or, of course, console gaming whatsoever. It's comparable, I suppose, to the kind of asymmetry that you would see in a game like Alien vs. Predator, where all 3 factions are clearly very different, although some effort was made to allow 1v1 fighting to be more of an option. Giants didn't really concern itself as much with that, although it did allow for the mechs to unlock various different kinds of weapons and powers, which would bring them onto a more even footing with the rest of the players in the game. Regardless, though, the mech team was always the largest to compensate for the fact that the individual characters were the weakest. This philosophy is also carried over to the single player, where you are accompanied by various AI companions in order to boost your firepower and to some degree your survivability. You didn't have to go in alone all the time. You could send in your AI companions to take some of that fire for you. However, the problem with this title is that you don't have the ability to save in the middle of a level. Especially for the last mech level, which is extremely long. That means you are likely going to have to restart the level entirely when you die, and you can die quite quickly if you don't stay mobile, especially if your AI companions have been killed off. After a certain number of deaths, your AI companions will not respawn, leaving you to deal with everything yourself, which can be a nightmare for various reasons. Not only does it mean you can only carry one Smartie at a time when attempting to increase the number of Smarties you have at your base, but you also have to defend the base solo from wave after wave after wave of Reaper men that are coming your way. This was an inherent problem and one of the main things that was criticized about the game, and it artificially inflated its difficulty. Later on, when you were able to play the Kabuto and the Sea Reaper Princess Delphi, who had much more powerful abilities and also more potent healing, things got a little bit easier, but I remember failing this mission known as the Battle over and over and over again, simply due to the fact that my AI companions were not good enough meat shields, and in-game saving was unfortunately not an option. Earlier on in the game, it's not too much of a problem because the missions are a lot smaller, but almost all of the base building missions in the game are very lengthy and can really drag on, especially if you need to collect a lot of Vimp meat, which you absolutely do for the mechs. I'd go as far as to say that while the base building mechanic is certainly key to what makes the game very, very interesting, it's also not that well implemented in single player, and I feel that they could have accelerated the rate at which you gathered Vimps or Smarties, or even just started you off with a couple of buildings in order to make this level a bit less laborious. When playing the Reaper faction, the Vimp gathering technique is an awful lot easier, simply because you are able to gather souls from both Vimps and fallen enemies, which are much, much easier to acquire, and mean that you can build the base an awful lot quicker than you can on the mech side. It also helps, of course, that the Reaper Princess Delphi is able to move extremely quickly around the map and has an arsenal of extremely powerful spells at her disposal. Let's have a look at some of them. Delphi represents the Reaper faction of the game and is the subject of the second part of the campaign. Strangely enough, she doesn't actually have that many missions, or more specifically, there aren't that many missions where you get to play as Delphi on her own. While the first section of the campaign is very much a third-person shooter with the mech faction, the second portion involves a mixture of pseudo-action RPG and jet ski racing. The Reaper Ski is a vehicle you can acquire from your Reaper base after building a pier, but they also decided it might be a good idea to base several of the levels on Reaper Ski racing. Outside of that, you can see that you're able to conjure a variety of extremely powerful spells. Indeed, this might remind you somewhat of Sacrifice from Shiny, and it certainly should, because Planet Moon was populated by many of the creative brains behind some of Shiny's classics. The Reaper campaign has several base building levels, although they are significantly easier thanks to the amount of power that you happen to have as Delphi and the ability to quick walk around the map, as you can see right there, which is extremely rapid. You would perhaps be surprised to know that the mechs are not, in fact, the fastest moving and most mobile faction in the game. That would be the Reapers, thanks to the incredibly quick Ghost Walk style ability, which targeted terrain on the ground and could actually allow you to move incredibly fast and incredibly far. That said, you don't have the same maneuverability as a mech does. Even though they move slower and their jetpack fuel is more limited, they can also adjust their flight in midair, whereas it's a bit more difficult to do that with the Reaper. The movement is more predictable since it has to travel in a straight line. That was key in the multiplayer, and of course could be used to put a rather well-placed sniper bullet in the head of a Reaper that was coming your way. The radically different movement system, combined with an arsenal of extremely powerful spells, made the Reaper levels feel different to the mech, which frankly were, at least early on, very easy to mistake for just another third-person shooter, as enjoyable and as funny as they might be. The Reaper faction is something of a power fantasy for those that love magic spells, rapid movement, and slicing up enemies with a sword and various kinds of magical arrows. The third and final faction, of course, the namesake of this game, is the Kabuto itself. Once the campaign reaches the Kabuto phase, you get a third-person rampage-inspired brawler in which you smash everything in your way, including buildings, armies of Sea Reapers, and of course chow down on a few as you go in order to regain health. Your aim here is to find Smarties and eat them, which will allow you to grow even larger and unlock various different abilities and moves. The Kabuto starts fairly small, although it gets an awful lot bigger later on. With Adrenaline mode, the Kabuto could perform a variety of wrestling moves, including power slams, splashes, and elbow drops, which would result in some terrain deformation and huge shockwaves all over the level. At this point, you're an engine of complete and total destruction, eating as many enemies as you can to regain health, which would also eventually allow you to spawn offspring, which could be used to tank damage and, of course, fight for you. Playing as the Kabuto is something of a joyous romp. It actually feels very much like a reward for all of the work that you've put in previous to that, and it does away with some of the frustration involved in babysitting your base in the single-player mode, allowing you to simply go all out and destroy everything you come across. All three factions are certainly a very different experience, but the Kabuto is clearly the most extreme departure from the other two that do share some similarities in terms of their combat style, as well as the fact that they can both build bases. The Kabuto needs no bases. In fact, it would rather there were no bases remaining on its island, and will do whatever is required to get rid of them. The Kabuto is a good demonstration of the fact that this game actually had building destruction, which is not something that was all that common back at that point. These days, of course, it's commonplace in titles like Battlefield, but even now, many single-player games don't really do the level of building and base destruction that you will find in Giant Citizen Kabuto. Many of the animations for the building destruction were very basic, with the buildings switching between various damaged states instantly without any animations to tie them together. But regardless, the terrain deformation, particle effects, and explosions at the time were very impressive and rarely seen in titles in the early 2000s. This level of destruction was, of course, made possible by the use of their custom engine, Amityville, but it is worth noting that the game on launch, and indeed to this very day, is still reasonably buggy, although you will not find bugs which impede your progress. You will see things like graphical artifacts and an awful lot of clipping problems in certain areas of the level. It's perhaps to be expected considering the size of the level and the amount of mobility you have. As both the mechs and the Reapers, you can basically go anywhere on the map that you can see. There aren't really any invisible walls, with the exception of way out to sea on the island. Outside of that, you can jetpack or teleport or ghost walk almost anywhere, and everything is textured, although not in every circumstance very well. Unfortunately, as a result perhaps of the levels being so large and the engine being only capable of so much, the islands are often fairly sparse. While Kabuto has plenty of stuff to smash and destroy, you'll find that large areas of the map in both the mech and Reaper campaigns are pretty much empty, not containing anything worthwhile. The maps will often task you with finding Smarties, which will not actually be marked, for the most part, on the in-game map itself, which often involves traipsing around trying to find small villages, with very little to encounter in between outside of the occasional Sea Reaper patrol. Some levels even seem to take great joy in hiding the Smarties in various obscure locations around the map with no real indication of where they might be, which can result in an awful lot of downtime. That said, the way that the larger open-world levels are set up is really quite intriguing and actually involves a basic AI, which will send patrols of various different kinds of Sea Reaper and Ripper creatures at you in an attempt to destroy your base as well as capture your Smarty leader. Again, this is a nod to the way that certain multiplayer modes work, which have combinations of base building and a capture the Smarty mechanic, which is very similar to capture the flag. Increasingly more dangerous patrols will head your way in an effort to level your base and capture your smarty leader. Although outside of that, once you've cleared out the initial emplacements and guard towers on the map, the AI is going to do little than try and defend its own fortress, as well as send waves of enemies at you. They're unfortunately not that smart. Every now and again, pathing becomes a problem, as the Sea Reapers will capture your smarty leader, but be unable to leave the base because they've got stuck on a wall or a building. While the patrols usually work together in order to take you down, there are plenty of circumstances where killing one Sea Reaper will not in fact alert the others to your presence, and they'll just sort of wander around until you start putting bullets in them. As a result of this, it can be argued that even though the base building levels are certainly very innovative, they may actually be the weakest levels in the game itself. Not only are they not particularly narratively driven, but they also don't have many scripted events, and the levels aren't set up or paced all that well. They're relying on the AI to do something interesting. In the meantime, you're gathering resources and attempting to build a base, which can actually take quite a long time. I have no doubt that improved AI as well as increased enemy variety and perhaps even a co-op mode would have alleviated a lot of these problems that I have. Although at the time I was just blown away by the fact that this game had anything of the sort. And up to that point with single-player games, you're more often than not dealing with indoor linear corridors. In this game, you have a giant island to explore and an AI which is perhaps not particularly predictable. The base defense and construction aspects were very interesting to me, and frankly, they still are. The game actually reminds me of a number of recent efforts to create survival games where you will build a shelter. Giant's base building system allowed you to do this almost 14 years ago. Whether or not it was the inspiration for future survival titles, or whether it simply got in a little bit early and was ahead of its time, well, that's very much up for debate. Thankfully, there's a great deal of the game that still holds up to this day. While some of the base building missions might be a little drawn out, the single-player campaign missions are usually very enjoyable. Not only do you have a good selection of weapons and items at your disposal, but the levels are fairly well designed and, of course, punctuated with hilarious cutscenes and moments. And the mech combat is a fairly standard third-person shooter affair, which holds up nicely to this day. You're able to carry up to 4 weapons, one of which is the infinite ammo pistol, and along with ordering around your AI companions, you're able to bring a fair amount of firepower to bear. There's also a good amount of customization, as you can see right here. You can equip a large variety of different packs, which all have different functions, draining your jetpack energy to fulfill them, as well as a decent number of weapons, consumable, and equipable items. As you might expect, these are slowly unlocked as the campaign progresses, giving you a nice selection of toys. Although it does tend to pile an awful lot on you at the very end of the mech campaign. It almost felt like the mech campaign needed a few extra levels to really explain a lot of this base building. Once the party house was constructed, as you can see here, you gain access to all sorts of fun toys, which are really only used in one level. It does make a certain degree of sense, since the mech and Reaper base building mechanics are extremely similar. The mech base building level, the final level of the mech campaign, serves almost as a tutorial for both the multiplayer and for the several base building missions that you'll find in the Reaper campaign. The mech campaign consists of almost exclusively third-person shooter missions, and then the final level suddenly throws base building mechanics at you, and then abruptly ends after that. It does, as far as I'm concerned, give further proof that the game was really designed to last based on its multiplayer, and that the single player, while very enjoyable, was almost a giant tutorial for the multiplayer component of the game. Thankfully, unlike various modern titles that do the same thing, the single-player campaign was both well fleshed out and extremely lengthy, at least in comparison to titles like Call of Duty that can be done in about 3 hours. The game certainly does not hold your hand. In fact, I would say to some degree it almost doesn't do enough to tell you where to go on these large islands. You can bring up a map which will often have objective markers, but every now and again it won't actually point you in the right direction. This is especially true when looking for smarties for your base, which are rather annoying to find, to say the least. Ultimately, though, Giant Citizen Kabuto was a very risky game to make. It was a mishmash of different mechanics. It could have been 3 separate games quite easily. It could have merely been a third-person shooter, which is actually what they ended up doing with the spiritual successor, Armed and Dangerous, which While it was a very good third-person shooter in its own right and kept all that signature sense of humor from Giant Citizen Kabuto and the past Shiny games, it didn't include complex base-building mechanics, nor 3 different factions, all of which controlled very differently. What's actually shocking is not only was a tiny team of 9 people able to construct a game this sprawling with this many different ideas, but the vast majority of ideas in the game are all implemented well and properly fleshed out. None of the 3 factions actually feel less than the rest. They all have their own unique experience attached to them, and they're all enjoyable in their own right. This is the kind of ambition that, frankly, you don't see an awful lot anymore. A game like this wouldn't be made in 2014, or if it was, it would focus on 1 faction, or maybe 2 at most, and it certainly wouldn't make them anywhere near as diverse, nor would it attempt an asymmetry where one character was clearly more powerful than the others. Giants was okay with that. Giants embraces imbalance. Imbalance generates both unique scenarios and experiences, and it really does make the multiplayer something completely unique, which unfortunately we may never see the likes of again. Even if the game wasn't this ambitious, even if the game didn't have so many interesting mechanics and systems, it would still be an enjoyable and amusing third-person shooter. The writing alone is enough to keep you playing. At the time, this game was a technical marvel. It still looks pretty good to this day. I haven't done too much to make it look better. I've simply patched it up to the latest version, which enabled the DirectX 8 effects that were given with the GeForce 3 version of the game. Yeah, it's that old, GeForce 3. There were 2 separate versions of the game released, actually. One that was focused on providing GeForce 3 specific effects, and the latest unofficial patch allows you to use those. The fact that it still supports widescreen resolutions even unpatched, and has just these glorious skyboxes and really memorable character designs is something to be both surprised and impressed by. It seems to perhaps be the trademark of those that worked on those great Shiny games a long time ago. Things like MDK and things like Sacrifice, they do have this certain timeless quality that really doesn't exist in most of the older 3D titles. It couldn't. The technology was simply too limited, but a small team of 9 people was able to make this massive, ambitious game. And that, to me, is just incredible. Sadly, Planet Moon didn't produce anything as ambitious ever again, and as I mentioned in the introduction, Planet Moon no longer exists, a sad tale told all too often. However, as usual, there is a silver lining. Not only is this game certainly very much playable, and with the 1.5 unofficial patch does have a server browser and the ability to host games for your friends, there is perhaps something new on the Giants' horizon. The story developer Nick Bruti, the founder of Planet Moon, and of course, someone that worked on absolute classics like MDK, Earthworm Jim, Cool Spot, and even Aladdin, has formed a new studio called Rogue Rocket Games, and they're aiming to crowdfund a title by the name of First Wonder, which promises to be a mix of Giant Citizen Kabuto, MDK, and Earthworm Jim. They aim to kickstart the game, which will hopefully be a great success, and you can find out more on the website first-wonder.com. That's first as a word, -wonder.com. As it stands, Giant Citizen Kabuto is, as usual, a flawed but rather wonderful experience that still holds up to this day, and frankly deserved more attention than it really got. A cult classic that should have been the founder of a brand new genre of multiplayer games, but as it stands, was a brave experiment perhaps never to be repeated. You can find a copy of Giant Citizen Kabuto over on GOG.com if you wish to experience it for yourself, and I've put a link to the unofficial 1.5 patch, which is highly recommended, also in the description below this video. Ladies and gentlemen, Giant Citizen Kabuto. My name has been TotalBiscuit. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.